everyone.
Hello.
What's up?
I don't know. What's up with you?
Well, just feeling a little tired, and I guess my TikToks got banned.
Yeah, I saw that.
And
Have you figured out what ones they were? They were the Ukraine ones, right?
yeah, the last few videos were definitely about the Ukraine. Well, it was basically the Crimea thing. I showed why Crimea. Like, hi, Shireen Abu Alek Akleh again. I showed why Crimea is separated, basically. I showed it was just like three small clips, and boom, I get banned.
That's not good. Yeah, so I don't know. You want to
Let's start with the first clip or whatever.
my sis okay. My I don't know. I'll go into the YouTube after. But all right. So what we were gonna show now was this. So Pelosi Taiwan visit. Beijing bows consequences if U.S. politician travels to island. Now, this had come out a few weeks ago before she had COVID,
She
and
has COVID too.
she had COVID, so she was supposed to go there, and then she didn't because of COVID. So that was going to be the excuse, like after China said, "I'm not," that we don't want you coming here.
Why is she coming then?
She thinks it's her duty to go. I mean,
To
even
do
like,
what?
well, I mean, she wants to. How do they put it?
Do a coup?
Well, yeah, but that's not what they say in the report.
What did I say?
She wants to, because of the human rights records and the pro democracy dissidents. She,
There are no pro democracy dissidents in Taiwan. What are you talking? I think she's confusing Taiwan with Hong Kong, and all the ones in Hong Kong are hopefully in prison by now.
yes, and she wants to visit because of Tiananmen Square.
Which is again not in Taiwan, that's in mainland.
Yeah, and
So she wants to go to two events that are not in Taiwan.
yes, that's her reason. But the
Even
military
though
doesn't want
the
her to
US
go.
government officially recognizes a one China policy, which means that it does not recognize Taiwan as a country.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Yeah, and even Biden said the military said you shouldn't go, and she's still thinking of going. She doesn't have a date set yet, but
okay, how is
this,
she gonna get there?
um, well, we're assuming she's going by plane.
Private jet? Like, okay, if it's a private jet, like, they just don't have to have her, like, the FIA can just not give her clearance to take off from US airspace. I mean,
Yeah, I
seriously.
mean they could stop her if they really want to stop her because
Here, or China, they could wait until China brings a. Oh, you know about how China? Okay, so you know how Canada was like trying to be a colonizer, and they were like flying over DPRK airspace.
yeah,
So apparently, I thought like these two Chinese fighter pilots came around and swatted the Canadian pilot out of this. Well, but I didn't realize it. But they like literally gave the Canadian pilot the finger, literally. But but then Canada cried about how China intercepted them from like being colonial in the DPRK, and it's like, yeah, just yeah, why were you like being
yeah,
nosy? Like, why do you need to? You don't need to fly over the DPRK ever,
yeah,
uh, unless they want you to, and they clearly don't.
yeah.
Um, so China is. It was pretty cool because China's never like done that where it's actually been like that brazen like like it's never protected DPRK airspace like that. Like, you know what I
Yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah. No,
And
that's
it seems like they've gotten a little bit more bold about it, like about telling that people to like fuck off, you colonizer. So, but yeah, so Taiwan, they can literally like they can actually shoot that plane down if they wanted to.
yeah. Pretty much, they
I hope
could.
they do, but they won't.
No, they won't. And this was the picture I was showing you earlier. Was this was the statue at the Capitol.
Yeah, and this is supposedly Tank Man, but Tank Man had two grocery bags. It was so weird. Do you have that clip of Tank Man?
Hold on, let me see if I. Where did I put it? Damn it.
Uh, yeah, Tankman had two grocery bags, and he came in, and I forgot what he did. He asked him a question, and then he got pushed away by the students.
Yeah. Hold on one second. Let me just pull up the.
So really, nothing happened to Tankman.
Yeah. So yeah, no, there was
Does
the.
China still view the West through the lens of the Opium War? No, they view the lens West through the lens of.
Oop,
Oh,
sorry. I don't know what
somebody
happened.
asked, does China still view the West through the lens of the Opium Wars? No, they view the West in the lens of like how psychotic they have been in the past hundreds of years. For example, China, the reason why China needed to have a one-child policy is not because of overpopulation, but because they could not get their food sovereignty. So they were always worried that if there's like another famine, like millions would die. So like until they got food sovereign, as in until they figured out how to grow enough food to feed their whole population by themselves, they were forced to have the one child policy. So they view the West in its full, disgusting, colonial evil that it is. Hi, Petan Milo. Um, yeah,
Hold
like you
on, let
don't.
me.
It's fine. It's okay. Okay, so let's we have part chapter 2 of Development of Capitalism in Russia by Lenin. So I pre-read it, and we're gonna try this live commenting for my pre-read reading.
Okay. So. All right. Hopefully. Oh, you know what? I just want to do that again because I want to make sure I did the volume. Because remember how it does that. Okay. Oh no, that's on the share screen. Okay, I got it.
The China's one-child policy will not come and haunt them because it's already over, and so far, it the only thing it's doing is that it's like it built a lot of like spoiled children, I guess, but nothing really. Uh, uh like it just made a lot of Chen Wei was.
Yeah. Did you answer this other one? Do they still view the West through
No,
the?
they view the West the way the West has not changed since the Opium Wars, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah.
Like Janet Yellen last week was like, we can't let China get minerals from Africa. We
Mhm.
need our African colonies.
Yep, yep.
No, it was because they were not food sovereign, as in they were not capable of growing enough food to feed their population. That's different from not having enough food. You can always import food. Um, but they were food sovereignty is different than like having food. A lot of countries have food when they're not food sovereign. So they did have enough food. They just were not 100% capable of growing 100% of their food needs. The
Mhm.
Boxer Rebellion, yeah, obviously. I mean, how has the West changed from the Boxer Rebellion? It has not. So I mean, okay, so are we ready?
Yeah.
Let's the fun begin.
First, you're gonna
So,
talk about
a Zemstvo stood
the
for some kind
Zemstvo.
of local self-government. Zemlya literally means land, and Zemstvo is basically people who uh, government who like I guess manage land affairs. And Lenin would always criticize them because he thought they were like liberal and kind of cringy, and they were. So let's start with chapter 2, differentiation of the peasantry. By peasantry, this definition means people who are not in the urban area and don't mean it to understand it as slaves or serfs. We have that in capitalist production, the basis for the formation of a home market is the process of disintegration of the small cultivators into agricultural entrepreneurs and workers. Almost every work on the economic position of the Russian peasantry in the post-reform period refers to the so-called differentiation of the peasantry. It must consequently be our task to study the principal features of this phenomenon and to determine its significance. In the following exposition, we employ the statistical data of Zemstvo house-to-house census from 1891. Section 1, Zemstvo statistics for Novorossiya. Mr. V. Postnikov, in his book Peasant Farming in South Russia, has collected and processed the Zemstvo statistics for the Tauridia and partly the Kherson and Ekaterinoslav gubernias. This book should be given the first place in the literature on the differentiation of the peasantry, and we consider it necessary to arrange according to the system we have adopted the data gathered by Mr. Postnikov, supplementing them occasionally with data from Zemstvo publications. The Zemstvo statisticians of Tauridia have grouped the peasant households according to area under crops. A very sound method, one that renders it possible to form a precise judgment of the economy of each group due to the predominance in that locality of grain cultivation with extensive farming. Here are the data for the economic groups in Tauridia peasantry. The unevenness in the distribution of
Hold on one second. I don't know why the video was getting stuck. Okay. All right. Asha?
I muted the camera because there was two of me and it looks weird.
It looks weird. You want to just go full screen and then, because
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. And you're still there. You can still talk.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let's start this.
The area under crops is very considerable.
Do you want to go back and look at that graph or?
Yeah.
Okay.
2/5 of the total households, comprising about 3/10 of the population for the size of these families, is below the average, possess about 1/8 of the total area under crops. They belong to the poor group, cultivating little land, who cannot cover their needs with their income from farming. Further, there are the middle peasants, also constituting about 2/5 of the total households, who cover their average expenditure by income from land. Mr. Postnikov considers that a family requires 16 to 18 desatines under crops to cover its average expenditure. Lastly, there are affluent peasants. About 1/5 of the households and about 3/10 of the population, who concentrate in their hands over half the area cultivated, the crop area per household clearly indicating the commercial character of the farming done by this group. In order to exactly estimate the extent of this commercial agriculture in various groups, Mr. Postnikov employs the following method. From the total crop area of the farm, he separates the following. The food area, which provides sustenance for the family and farm laborers. The fodder area, which provides fodder for the cattle. The farm service area, seed plot and land occupied by buildings, and thus arrives at the size of the market or commercial area, the produce of which goes for sale. It is shown that the group with 5 to 10 desatines under crops, only 11.5 8% of the cultivated area yields produce for the market. Whereas this percentage grows with the increase in area under crops as follows: 36.5%, 52%, 61%. Consequently, the affluent peasants, the top two groups, engage in what is commercial cultivation and secure a gross money income ranging from 574 to 1,500 rubles per annum. This commercial cultivation then becomes capitalist farming because the areas cultivated by the well-to-do peasants exceed the family labor norm, i.e., the amount of land that a family can cultivate by its own labor, and compels them to resort to the hiring of workers. In the three northern uyezds of the Tauredia gubernia, the author estimates that the rich peasants hire over 14,000 rural workers. The poor peasants, on the contrary, provide workers over 5,000, that is, resort to the sale of their labor power, because the income from cultivating the land amounts in the 5 to 10 desatine groups, for example, to only 30 rubles in cash for the household. We observe here, consequently, the very process for the creation of the home market that is dealt with by the theory of capitalist production. The home market grows as a result of conversion into a commodity of the product of commercial entrepreneur farming on the one hand, and of the conversion into a commodity of the labor power sold by the poor peasants on the other. In order to acquaint ourselves more closely with this phenomenon, let us examine the position of each separate group of the peasantry. Let us start with the top group. Here are the data for the amount of land it owns and uses.
Okay, Esha,
Yeah,
you want to talk anything on this table, or you're okay?
I'm too tired to talk.
All right, so you want me to play through this, and then we'll go through the other stuff?
If possible, yeah, play through this, please.
Okay, I'm gonna mute you though, so unmute yourself if you need to talk. Okay.
Okay. We see, accordingly, that the affluent peasants, notwithstanding the fact that they are best provided with allotment land, concentrate into their hands the bulk of the purchased and rented land and turn into landholders and capitalist farmers. On renting of 17 to 44 desatines of land, there is an annual expenditure at local prices of about 70 to 160 rubles. Obviously, we are dealing here with a commercial transaction. The land becomes a commodity, a money-making machine. Let's take the data for the livestock and implements. Implements means carting, carts covered and open wagons. Plowing means iron plows and scarifiers, cultivators. Thus, the well-to-do peasantry are far better supplied with implements than the poor and even the middle peasantry. It is sufficient to glance at this table to see how totally fictitious are the average figures which people are so fond of bringing into play when talking about the peasantry. Commercial cultivation of the peasant bourgeoisie is accompanied here by commercial livestock farming, namely the breeding of coarse wool sheep, Regarding implements, we shall quote in addition figures for improved implements, which we have taken from Zemstvo statistical returns. Out of the total reaping and mowing machine, 3,061, 2,841 or 92.8% belong to the peasant bourgeoisie, the top 1/5 of the total households. It's quite natural that well-to-do peasantry also employ a farming technique much above the average. Larger the size of farm, more plentiful supply of implements, available financial resource, etc. That is to say, the well-to-do peasants do their sowing faster, make better use of favorable weather, sow the seed in more humid soil, and reap their harvest in proper time. They thresh their grain as it is carted in the field, etc. It is also natural that the expenditure on the production of agricultural produce diminishes per unit of product as the size of product increases. Mr. Postnikov proves this proposition in particular detail using the following system of calculation. He determines the number of people working, including hired laborers, the number of draft animals, implements, etc., per 100 descatines of crop areas in the various groups of peasantry. It is proved that these numbers diminish as the size of the farm increases. For example, for those cultivating under 5 descatines have per 100 descatines of allotment land, 28 people working, 28 draft animals, and 4.7 plows and scarifiers, 10 carts. Whereas those cultivating over 50 lands have 7 people working, 14 draft animals, 3.8 plows and scarifiers, and 4.3 carts. We omit the more detailed data for all the groups, referring those interested in the details to Mr. Postnikov's book. The author's general conclusion is, with the increase in the size of the farm and in the area cultivated by the peasant, the expenditure on the maintenance of labor power, human and animal, that prime item of expenditure in agriculture progressively decreases, and among groups that cultivate large areas, drops to nearly 1/2 per desatine under crops of the expenditure among the groups with small cultivated areas. To this law of the greater productivity and hence the greater stability of the peasant farms, Mr. Postnikov quite rightly attaches the importance, proving it with very detailed data not only for Novorossiya alone, but also for the central gubernias of Russia.
Before Asha gets into that note, I'm just gonna let you guys know Asha wasn't feeling great right before the show, and so I think she just got sick, so she is not coming back on the show. So I'm just going to finish playing this. There's about 20 more minutes of it, and she's just reading chapter 2 of Development of Capitalism in Russia, and then I don't know if we're going to revisit this next week or sometime this week or something like that. So just you can hold on and just watch the rest of it, and that's fine. And we'll come back and let you know if we're going to make up the show or just going to be on next week. Okay.
Zemstvo statistics prove incontrovertibly that the larger the scale of the peasant farm, the smaller number of implements, workers, draft animals are employed on a given tillage area. The further the penetration of commodity production into crop cultivation, and consequently the keener the competition among agriculturists, the struggle for land and for economic independence, the more vigorously must this law be manifested, which leads to the ousting of the middle and poor peasants by the peasant bourgeoisie into the factory. It must, however, be noted that technical process in the agricultural It must, however, be noted that technical progress in agriculture expresses itself in different ways depending on the system of agriculture, on the system of field cultivation. Whereas in the case of grain growing and extensive cultivation, this progress may find expression in a mere expansion of crop area and reduction in the number of workers and animals per unit of crop area. In the case of livestock or industrial crop farming, with the adoption of intensive agriculture, the same progress may find expression, for example, in the cultivation of root crops, which require more workers per unit of crop area, or in the acquisition of dairy cattle, the cultivation of fodder grasses, etc., etc. The description of the top group of the peasantry must be supplemented by indicating the considerable employment of the wage labor. Here is the data for the 3 uyas of the Tauridia gubernia. Mr. Vivi, in the above-mentioned article, argued about this question as follows. He took the farms employing workers as a percentage of the total number of peasant farms and arrived at the conclusion that the number of peasants resorting to hired labor for the cultivation of land as compared to the aggregate mass of the people is quite insignificant. 2 to 3, a maximum of 5 peasant farmers out of 100 are all that represent peasant capitalism. Peasant farming in Russia employing laborers is not a system firmly rooted in contemporary economic life, but something fortuitous such as occurred 100 and 200 years ago. Vestnik Evropy, European Vision, that itself is an irritating thing. Vestnik Evropy, 1884. What sense is there in comparing the number of farms employing workers with the total number of peasant farms when the latter figure also includes the plots of farm laborers? Why, by this method, one could also get rid of capitalism in Russian industry. One would only need to take families engaging in industries who employ wage workers, i.e. families of manufacturers large and small, as a percentage of the total number of families engaging in industries in Russia. The result would be quite insignificant percentage of the mass of people. It is far more correct to compare the number of farms employing laborers with the number of actually independent farms, i.e. of those living on agriculture alone and not resorting to the sale of their labor power. Furthermore, Mr. Vivi lost sight on a triple, namely that the peasant farms employing laborers are among the biggest. The percentage of farms employing laborers are insignificant when taken in general on the average, turns out to be very imposing, 34 to 64% among the well-to-do peasantry, who account for more than half the total production and produce large quantities of grain for sale. Kulaki. One can therefore judge how absurd is the opinion that farming based on employment of laborers is fortuitous, something that occurred 100 to 200 years ago. Thirdly, only by disregarding the real specific feature of cultivation can one take as the criteria of peasant capitalism only farm laborers, i.e. regular workers, and ignore day laborers. It is commonly known that hiring day laborers plays a very particularly important role in agriculture. Day laborers are people you hire just for that day, where you go out into the, I don't know, fields and say, yo, I got some work for today. I'll give you 5 rubles. That's a day laborer. Okay. Let's take the bottom group. It consists of peasants who cultivate no land who cultivate little. They do not differ much in economic status. Both groups serve as farm laborers for their fellow villagers or engage in outside, mainly agricultural employment, i.e. belong to the rural proletariat. Let us note, for example, that in the Dnieper Uyezd, the bottom group constitutes 40% of the households, and those having no plowing implements, 39% of the total households. In addition to selling their labor power, the rural proletariat obtain an income from leasing their allotment land. The 3 uyezds of Tauridia Gubernia, the land leased in 1884 to 1886 amounted to 25% of the total peasant arable land. This does not include leased land, not to peasants, but to middle-class intellectuals. In all, nearly 1/3 of the population in these 3 uyezds lease land. The allotments of the rural proletariat are rented mainly by the peasant bourgeoisie. Here are the data in this regard. Allotment land is now an object of extensive speculation among southern Russian peasants. Land is used as security for loans on promissory notes. Land is leased or sold for 1 to 2 years or for longer periods, 8, 9, or 11 years. Thus, the peasant bourgeoisie is also a representative of the merchants and usurers' capital, and itself resorts to very numerous village banks and loan and saving society, which renders substantial assistance to prosperous peasants. The economically weak peasants can't find guarantors and do not get loans. Here we have a striking refutation of Narodnik prejudice, that the kulak or the usurer have nothing in common with the enterprising mujik. On the contrary, the threads of both merchants' capital, the loaning of money on the security of land and buying up of various products, and of industrial capital, commercial agriculture with the aid of wage workers, merge into the hand of the peasant bourgeoisie. Okay. It depends on the surrounding circumstances, on the greater and lesser degree to which the Asiatic way of life is eliminated and culture is widespread in our countryside, as to which of these forms of capital will develop at the expense of the other. Let's examine finally the position of the middle group, cultivating from 5 to 10 dесятines per household with an average of 6.4 dесятines. Its position is a transitional one. Money income from agriculture, 191 rubles, is somewhat lower than the sum annually spent by the average Tauridian, 200 to 250 rubles. Here, draft animals work out at 3.2 head per household, whereas a full team of 4 are required. Hence, the position of the middle peasant's farm is an unstable one. He has to resort to yoking. In Melitopol Uyezd, out of 13,789 households in this group, only 4,218 till their land with their own animals. 9,201 yoke. In the Dnieper Uyezd, out of the 8,234 households, 4,029 till the land with their own animals, and 3,835 yoke. In above-mentioned articles, Mr. Vivi argues that the great deal about yoking being the principle of cooperation. It is so simple to hush up the fact that peasantry are breaking up into sharply distinct groups, that yoking is the cooperation of the tottering farms, which are being ousted by the peasant bourgeoisie, and to talk about the general principle of cooperation is probably cooperation between the rural proletariat and the rural bourgeoisie. Cultivation of the land on a yoking basis is, it goes without saying, less productive. Time lost in moving from place to place, shortage of horses, etc. So that in one village, for example, Mr. Postnikov was informed that yokers often sacrifice no more than 1 desiatine per day, which is half the normal rate. And if we add that in the middle group to about 1/5 of the households have no plowing implements, and that this group provides more workers than it hires, according to Mr. Postnikov's calculations, its unstable character, its transitional position between the peasant bourgeoisie and the rural proletariat will be clear. We shall quote somewhat more detailed data about the ousting of the middle group. See table on page 81. Thus, the distribution of allotment land is most equalized, although here too, the ousting of the bottom group by the top ones is marked. But the situation radically changes when we pass from this compulsorily held land to free, i.e., to the purchased and rented land. The concentration of this land is enormous, and as a result, the distribution of total land in use by peasants is quite unlike the distribution of allotment land. The middle group is pushed into second place, 46% of the allotment land, 41% of the land in use. Well-to-do group very considerably enlarges its holding, 28% of the allotment land, 46% of the land in use, while the poor group is being pushed out of the ranks of the cultivators, 25% of the allotment land, 12% of the land in use. This table reveals an interesting phenomenon, one that we shall meet again, namely the decline in the role of allotment land in peasant farming. In the bottom group, this is due to the leasing out of land. In the top group, to the fact that the total farming area purchased and rented is overwhelmingly predominant. The remnants of the pre-reform system, the tying of the peasants to the land and equalized tax-assessed land tenure, is being utterly destroyed by the penetration of capitalism into agriculture. As for land renting in particular, the figure given enable us to clear up a very common mistakes in the arguments of the Narodnik economists on this subject. Take the argument of Mr. Vivi. In the article quoted above, he bluntly raised the issue of the relation of renting of land to the breakup of the peasantry. Does the renting of land help to differentiate the peasant farms into big and small and to destroy the average typical group? Mr. Vivi answered this question in the negative. Here are his arguments. The large percentage of persons who resort to renting of land, example 38 to 68, 40 to 70, 30 to 66, 50 to 60 respectively in different uyezds of different gubernias. The small size of the rented plots per household, 3 to 5 desiatines, according to Tambov statistical returns. The peasants with small allotments rent more land than those with big ones. To enable the reader to clearly judge the appropriateness of the argument, let alone their soundness, we quote the corresponding figure for the Dnieper uyezd. The question arises of what importance can average figures be here? Does the fact with those who rent land are many 56% really do away with the concentration of rented land in the hands of the rich? Is it not ridiculous to take the average area of rented land, 12 desiatines per renting household? Very often, it is not even per renting households, but per existing household that is taken. That is what Mr. Karyshev, for example, does in his work, Peasant Rentings of Non-Allotment Land. By putting together peasants of whom one takes 2 desiatines at a fabulous price, 15 rubles, evidently out of dire need on ruinous terms, while another takes 48 desatines over and above his own adequate land, buying the land wholesale at the incomparably low price of 3.55 rubles per desatine. No less hollow is the third argument. Mr. Vivi himself took care to refute it by admitting that the figure relating to entire village communities, in classifying the peasants according to allotment, do not present a true picture of what is taking place in the community itself. The data for the Melitopol and Berdyansk uyezd are analogous. Mr. Postnikov cites an interesting example of a similar mistake made by the Zemstvo statisticians, noting the fact of commercial farming by well-to-do peasants and their demand for land. He points out that the Zemstvo statisticians evidently regarding such manifestations in peasant life as something illegitimate and try to belittle their importance. To prove that the renting of land is determined not by the competition of rich peasants, but by the peasants' need for the land, to prove this, Mr. Werner, a compiler of the Tauredia Gubernia handbook, classified the peasants of the entire Tauredia Gubernia according to the size of allotment. Taking the group of peasants with 1 or 2 working and 2 to 3 draft animals, it turns out that within the bounds of this group, as the size of the allotment increases, the number of renting households and the amount of rented land decrease. Obviously, such a method of calculation proves nothing at all, since only a peasant with an equal number of draft animals are taken, and it is the extreme groups that are omitted. It is quite natural where the number of draft animals is equal, the amount of cultivated land must also be equal, and consequently, the smaller the allotment land, the larger the amount of rented land. The question is how the rented land is distributed among households with the unequal number of draft animals and implements. It would be a great mistake to imagine that the concentration of rented land in the hands of the peasant bourgeoisie is limited to individual renting and does not apply to renting by the village community. Nothing of the kind. The rented land is always distributed according to where the money lies. And the relationship between the groups of peasantry does not change in the least where the land is rented by the community. Hence the argument by Mr. Karyashev, for example, that the relation between community renting and individual renting expresses a conflict between 2 principles, communal and individual. That community renting is characterized by the labor principle and the principle of even distribution of rented land among community members. This argument belongs entirely in the sphere of Narodnik prejudices. Notwithstanding the task he set himself in summing up the result of the Zemstvo statistical investigation, Mr. Karyashev carefully avoided the abundant Zemstvo statistical material about the concentration of rented land in the hands of a small group of well-to-do peasants. Let us quote an example. In the 3 indicated uyezds of the Tauredia Gubernia, state lands rented by the peasant communities are distributed among the group as follows. A little illustration of labor principle and of principle of even distribution. Such are the Zemstvo statistical data on peasant farming in South Russia. No room is left by these data for doubting the complete differentiation of the peasantry, the complete domination in the countryside of the peasant bourgeoisie. Highly interesting, therefore, that the attitude of Mr. Vivi and Enon towards these data. The more so that formerly both these writers admitted the need for raising the problem of the differentiation of the peasantry, Mr. Vivi in the above mentioned article, and Mr. Anan on Slova, the word, in 1880, when he remarked that the interesting phenomenon in the village community itself, that the unenterprising muziks neglect their land, while the enterprising ones take the best land for themselves. It should be noted that Mr. Postnikov's work is of a dual character. On the one hand, the author skillfully gathered and carefully processed extremely valuable Zemstvo statistics and managed to do so to escape the tendency to regard the peasant community as something integral, homogeneous, as it is still held to be by our urban intelligentsia. On the other, the author, not being guided by theory, failed to totally appraise the data he had processed and regarding them from the extremely narrow viewpoint of measures proceeding to concoct projects about agricultural handicraft factory communities and about the necessary of restricting and joining observing. Well, then, our neurotics did their best to ignore the positive part of Mr. Postnikov's work and concentrated their attention on the second part. Both Mr. Vivi and Mr. Ananon began with highly serious air to refute Mr. Postnikov's absolutely unserious projects, accusing him of evil intention of introducing capitalism into Russia and carefully avoiding the data which revealed the prevalence of capitalist relations in the countryside of South Russia today. It is interesting, wrote Mr. Anon, that Mr. Postnikov has projects for 60 Desetine peasant farms since agriculture has fallen into the hands of capitalists. Productivity of labor may grow still more tomorrow, and it will be necessary to convert 60 Desetines into 200 and 300 Desetine farms. You see how simple it is, because the petty bourgeoisie of today in our countryside will be threatened tomorrow by the big bourgeoisie. Therefore, Mr. Ananon refuses to recognize either today's petty or tomorrow's big bourgeoisie.